The myth of Moses. In the vast landscapes of ancient Egypt, where pyramids kissed the sky and the Nile River flowed with life, a tale began that would shape the destiny of a nation and influence three of the world's major religions. Amid political tension, the reigning pharaoh felt threatened by the ever-growing population of the Israelites. What was his drastic solution? All newborn Hebrew boys were to be cast into the Nile. Moses' mother, unwilling to lose her son, crafted a clever plan. She placed Moses in a basket and hid it among the river reeds. Fate, or divine intervention, led Pharaoh's daughter to this very spot. Moved by the infant's cries, she decided to adopt him. And so, Moses, a Hebrew by birth, grew up in the opulence of Pharaoh's palace. As Moses matured, he became increasingly aware of the harsh treatment his Hebrew kin endured. When he intervened in a violent dispute, it resulted in the death of an Egyptian, forcing Moses to flee Egypt for the rugged terrains of Midian. In the solitude of Midian, while shepherding flocks, Moses stumbled upon an unusual sight, a bush engulfed in flames, yet remained unscathed. This burning bush became the conduit for God's message. Moses was chosen to liberate the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. Armed with divine purpose, when stuttering Moses and his brother Aaron first approached Pharaoh to request the release of the Israelites, a display of divine power was in order. It done, Pharaoh's magicians, using their own secret arts, replicated the feat, turning their staffs into snakes as well. However, the serpent born of Moses' staff swiftly devoured those of the magicians, a symbolic victory that showcased the superior power of the God of Israel. The Pharaoh was stubborn, leading to a series of devastating plagues. 10 to be precise, ranging from the Nile turning to blood to the death of the firstborns. Eventually, Pharaoh relented and the Exodus commenced. Pursued by the regretful Pharaoh and his army, the Israelites faced the seemingly insurmountable barrier of the Red Sea. But with a divine gesture from Moses, in the Sinai desert, Moses received the 10 Commandments atop Mount Sinai, a moral code that would shape the ethical foundation for generations. This mountaintop experience was transformative, in that Moses' face would shine like the sun. However, the journey was riddled with challenges, including the people's occasional lapses into idolatry, like with the infamous golden calf. While the Israelites were wandering in the desert, they encountered snakes, but these snakes put them in a much more distressing scenario. The Israelites, in a moment of frustration and impatience, spoke against God and Moses. In response, God sent venomous serpents among the people, resulting in many deaths. Recognizing their transgression, the Israelites repented and pleaded with Moses to intercede on their behalf. Instructed by God, Moses crafted a bronze serpent and mounted it on a pole. Those bitten had but to gaze upon this bronze serpent to be healed, a symbol of God's mercy and the power of divine intervention. Despite his leadership, due to certain transgressions, Moses was informed he wouldn't enter the promised land. As the Israelites approached their destination, Moses climbed Mount Nebo after passing off the leadership to Joshua. From its peak, he gazed upon the land he'd never set foot in, and then, surrounded by clouds of mystery, Moses departed from the world. Why is Moses important? The purpose of this documentary. Moses is not just an incredibly important biblical figure in terms of theology and the biblical narrative. He is arguably the keystone that holds the Bible together. We're told that Jesus came to fulfill every jot and tittle of the Mosaic law, the 10 Commandments, and other rules that came from the Exodus accounts. The author of the Gospel of Matthew saw Jesus as the new Moses. Before Jesus, Moses was arguably the most important biblical figure. Jesus had to be bigger and better than Moses and to emulate his story. Moses and the supposed events of Exodus from Egypt were the foundations upon which the rest of the Bible and Christianity were built. But what if Moses was largely or entirely a myth? One could say that this realization would cause the edifice of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to crumble to rubble like the walls of Jericho. Without Moses, what are the Abrahamic faiths but a castle in the air devoid of a solid base? Another myth of Moses. When we talk about the myth of Moses, we're not being merely provocative, but expressing a reality about how Moses has functioned through the ages for many cultures. And to understand how his myth has influenced Judaism and its descendant traditions, we must look at another story, one you won't find in your Bible. The oldest story of Moses that we can positively identify its place and date of creation comes not from the Holy Land, but from the alleged birthplace of the great man. The Nile River Delta is fertile ground for both the seeds of plants and the seeds of stories. It was in a folk tradition emerging after the conquest of Alexander the Great that gives us another tale of Moses and his arrival in Palestine. This story was almost lost if it were not preserved by Hecataeus of Abdera and paraphrased in Diodorus Siculus' Library of History 43.
And the most outstanding and active among them banded together and journeyed to Greece and certain other regions. Their leaders were notable men, chief among them Danius, but the greater number settled in what is now called Judea, which is not far distant from Egypt and was in that time utterly desolate. The colony was headed by a man named Moses, outstanding both in his wisdom and courage. On taking possession of the land he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all called Jerusalem. In addition, he established the temple that they hold in chief veneration, instituted their form of worship and ritual, drew up the laws related to other political institutions, and ordered them. He also divided the peoples into 12 tribes, since this is regarded as the most perfect number and corresponds to the number of months that make up a year. He picked out the men of most refinement and with the greatest ability to head the entire nation, and appointed them priests. And he ordained that they should occupy themselves with the temple and the honor and sacrifice offered to their gods. These same men he appointed to be judges in all major disputes and entrusted to them the guardianship of laws and custom. Their lawgiver was careful also to make provisions for warfare and required the young men to cultivate manliness, steadfastness, and generally the endurance of every hardship. He led out military expeditions against the neighboring tribe, and after annexing much land appointed to them, assigned equal allotments to private citizens and greater ones to the priests in order that they, by virtue of receiving more ample revenue, might be undistracted and apply themselves continually to the worship of God. The most common people were forbidden to sell their individual plots, lest there be some who, for their own advantage, should buy them up, and by oppressing the poorer classes, bring them on a scarcity of manpower. He required those that dwelt in the land to rear children, and since their offspring could be cared for at little cost, the Jews were from the start a populous nation. Such is the account of Hecataeus of Miletus, actually Abdera, in regard to the Jews.
There are some familiar elements here. There is the mention of the 12 tribes of Israel, Moses as lawgiver, and the conquest of the land. But that is where the similarities end. This Moses was not a Jew himself, but a full-blooded Egyptian, and he is leaving Egypt to found a new colony, not because he is forced out or trying to escape. This is not an exodus and a freedom from slavery from Egyptian power, but the expansion of it into a desolate land. It was not the arrival into a promised land of milk and honey. There is here no suffering in the wilderness, no plagues upon the land, no parting of the waters. And here, Moses is not some criminal who killed a fellow Egyptian, but a noble and courageous leader. His priesthood is based on a merit rather than his brother getting a piece of the pie when it comes to a new theocratic order. And let's not forget, this Egyptian Moses enters into Palestine, founds its capital city, and builds its temple. He was the one that established the tribal system, rather than saving those tribes from bondage. This isn't the only such colonization story the Egyptians were telling, as they also claim to have founded the major cities in Greece and Babylon. In other words, these are stories of supposed Egyptian greatness, and they seem to be completely ignorant of the Exodus tradition from Israel, let alone the particular version of the story found in the Bible. What is fascinating about this story is that it's independent of the story in the Tanakh. It doesn't even seem to know the Jews had a tradition. They were escaped slaves from Egypt. So where did this story come from? Well, it looks like another case of influence by the Greeks in the wake of the armies of Alexander. The model of colonizers leaving the motherland was a common trope in Hellenic and Hellenistic stories of the origins of peoples. Numerous towns and territories were founded by the children of Hercules, and their names were given over to the regions. or they otherwise had some other etiological function. These stories were created to explain observations of the world, even if they were grounded in the imagination. How the Egyptians imagined the past was also influenced by their history, and there is yet another myth of Moses within Egyptian folklore. According to one Egyptian priest named Manetho, there was a great trauma in his country's past, and Moses was a key figure in that history. Here is what Manetho had to say, as quoted by the Jewish historian Josephus.
This writer, who has undertaken to translate the history of Egypt from the sacred book, began by stating that our ancestors came against Egypt with many tens of thousands and gained the mastery over the inhabitants. And then he himself admitted that by a later date again, they were driven out of the country, occupying what is now Judea, founded Jerusalem, and built the temple. Up to this point, he followed the Chronicles. Thereafter, by offering to record the legends and current talk about the Jews, he took the liberty of interpolating improbable tales in his desire to confuse us with a crowd of Egyptians who for leprosy and other maladies had been condemned, he said, for banishment from Egypt. Amenophis conceived and desired to behold the god as Or, one of the predecessors on the throne, had done, and he communicated his desire of his namesake Amenophis, Papias' son, who in virtue of his wisdom and knowledge of the future was reputed to be a partaker of the divine nature. His namesake then replied that he would be able to see the gods if he cleansed the whole land of lepers and other polluted persons. The king was delighted and assembled all of those in Egypt whose bodies were wasted by disease. They numbered 80,000 persons. These he cast into the stone quarries in the east of the Nile, there to work segregated from the rest of the Egyptian. Among them, Manetho adds, there were some of the learned priests who had been attacked by leprosy. Then this wise seer Amenophis was filled with dread of divine wrath against him and the king if the outrage done to these people should be discovered, and he added a prediction that certain allies would join the polluted people and would take possession of Egypt for 13 years. Not venturing to make this prophecy himself to the king, he left a full account of his writings and then took his own life. The king was filled with despondency. Then Manetho continues as follows. I quote his account verbatim. When the men in the stone quarries had suffered hardship for a considerable time, they begged the king to assign to them a dwelling place and a refuge, the deserted city of the shepherds, Avaris, and he consented. According to religious tradition, this city was from earliest time dedicated to Typhon. Occupying this city and using the region as a base for revolt, they appointed as their leader one of the priests of Hierapolis called Osarsaphus, and took an oath of obedience to him in everything. First of all, he made it a law that they should neither worship the gods nor refrain from any of the animals prescribed as especially sacred to Egypt, but should sacrifice and consume all alike, and that they should have intercourse with none save those of their own confederacy. After framing a great number of laws like these, completely opposite to Egyptian custom, he ordered them that their multitude of hands to repair the walls of the city and make ready of war against King Amenophis. Then, acting in concert with certain other priests and polluted persons like himself, he sent an embassy to the shepherds who had been expelled by Thutmoses in the city called Jerusalem, and setting forth the circumstances of himself and his companions in distress, he begged them to unite wholeheartedly in an attack upon Egypt. He offered to conduct them first to their ancestral home of Avaris, to provide their hosts with lavish supplies, to fight on their behalf whenever need arose, and to bring Egypt without difficulty under their sway. Overjoyed at this proposal, all the shepherds, in the number of 200,000, eagerly set out, and before long came to Avaris. When Amenophis, king of Egypt, learned of their invasion, he was sorely troubled, for he recalled the prediction of Amenophis, son of Papias. First, he gathered a multitude of Egyptians, and having taken counsel of the leading men among them, he summoned to their presence the sacred animals, which were held in greatest reverence in the temple, and gave instructions to each group of priests to conceal the images of the gods as securely as possible. And for his 5-year-old son, Rapses, he sent him away safely to his friend. He then crossed the Nile with many as 300,000 of the bravest warriors of Egypt and met the enemy. But instead of joining battle, he decided that he must not fight against the gods and made a hasty retreat to Memphis. There he took into his charge Apis and the other sacred animals which he had summoned to that place, and forthwith he sent off for Ethiopia with the whole army at the hosts of the Egyptians. The Ethiopian king, who in gratitude for his service had become his subject, welcomed him, maintained the whole multitude with such products of the country as were fit for human consumption, assigned to them cities and villages sufficient for the destined period of 13 years banishment from the realm, and especially stationed an Ethiopian army on the frontiers of Egypt to guard King Amenophis and his followers. Meanwhile, the Solomonites, or dwellers in Jerusalem, made a descent among the polluted Egyptians and treated the people so impiously and savagely that the domination of the shepherds seemed like a golden age to those who witnessed the present enormities. For not only did they set towns and villages on fire, pillaging the temples and mutilating images of the gods without restraint, but they also made a practice of using the sanctuaries as kitchens to roast the sacred animals which people worship. And they would compel the priests and prophets to sacrifice and butcher the beasts, afterwards casting the men forth naked. It is said the priests who framed their constitution and their laws was a native of Heliopolis named Osarseph, and after the god Osiris, worshipped at Heliopolis. But when he joined the people, he changed his name and was called Moses. 13 years later, this being the destined time of exile, Amenophis, according to Manetho, advanced from Ethiopia with a large army and joined battle against the shepherds and the polluted people. He defeated them, killing many and pursuing them to the frontiers of Syria.
This is certainly not the story of Moses you heard in Sunday school. In this tale, which Josephus said was a modern folklore, a priest named Osarseph was the leader of an enslaved leper colony. He was himself an Egyptian, but he invited the shepherds from Jerusalem to come and invade. These shepherds were the Hyksos, an earlier Semitic group that had ruled Egypt for about a century, and according to Manetho, they had already been kicked out before the rise of Osarseph. In other words, this story is not about the Bible or the Jews. Where did this tale of lepers ruling Egypt come from? Why was it said to have lasted 13 years? According to Egyptologist Jan Assmann, the story is about the religious reforms of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who pioneered something much like monotheism, establishing a new city, Amarna. In this city, he promoted his new cult to the Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten reduced the funding of the traditional priesthood, and the pharaoh was reviled for his new religious movement. On top of that, a terrible epidemic came through, which was called the Canaanite disease, adding proof to the average Egyptian that the gods did not favor these religious reforms. No wonder then that the statues of Akhenaten were destroyed, his name etched out from inscriptions, and his sarcophagus desecrated. Egypt tried to forget him, but the trauma of his reforms lived on. Take a look at this stele that was erected not long after, trying to restore the greatness of the past and speaking of the bad times as the land being filled with surpassing suffering or grave disease.
The temples were desolated. Their holy places were on the verge of disintegration. They had become piles of rubble, overgrown with thistles. Their chapels were as if they had never been. Their temples precinct were trodden roads. The land was in grave ailment. The gods had turned their back on this land. If one sent soldiers to Syria to extend the frontiers of Egypt, they had no success. If one appealed to the gods for succor, they did not come. If one besought a goddess likewise, she came not. Their hearts had grown weak in their bodies, for they had destroyed what had been created.
These are the words of Akhenaten's own son, King Tut, and he describes his father's reign in terms of trauma. Look again at the story of Osarseph. He also instituted a new religious order focused on one god and not to worship any others. This sounds like an echo of the reforms of Akhenaten. And how long did Akhenaten rule in Amarna? About 13 years, just like in the story. But what about the lepers? Well, leprosy was treated in the same sort by the Egyptians as did the Jews. According to Leviticus 13-14, a leper was an unclean person separate from the divine. So having an entire kingdom of lepers would be a sure way to say it was a godless society. The tale of Osarseph looks much more like the story of an Egyptian pharaoh who was reviled and whose memory was left to rot in the imagination of the Egyptian people. And then somehow he became known as Moses. Why? There is nothing in the story told by Manetho that made Moses a Jew. Quite the opposite. He was an Egyptian priest and named after the god Osiris. Only Semitic people in the story were the shepherds, that is the Hyksos. These were not Jews. even though they were said to have moved to and then invaded from Palestine. In fact, the name of Moses seems to be a gloss onto the original Osarseph tale. Manetho is trying to connect this folktale to another folk figure in Egyptian imagination, and Hecataeus already told us about that Moses. It seems Manetho is conflating together the brave colonist, Moses, and the leper king Osarseph, because they both involved Egyptian colonization, the land of Palestine, and the key figures were leaders and lawgivers. In other words, there is nothing to do with the Exodus story of the Bible. The only commonality is the name of Moses. But we already saw the Moses described by Hecataeus has nothing to do with the Moses within the pages of the Bible. Stepping back, one has to wonder, where did Moses come from? The Moses of Hecataeus and the Moses of Exodus are so different. Can they even be the same person? Do they at least have the same mother? Who is your daddy? And what does he do? Let's actually look at the birth of Moses again, and let's see the legendary layers unfold. Birth story of Moses. All right, tell me you've heard this story before.
My mother was a high priestess. My father I knew not. My high priestess mother conceived me. In secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the water drawer. Aki, the water drawer, took me as his son and reared me.
Seems like the same basic outline of the Moses story. But the author of this was not Moses. Oh no, dear viewer. This comes from the autobiographic inscriptions of Sargon of Akkad, who ruled almost a millennium before the Exodus allegedly took place. The fragments of this story exist in inscriptions older than any manuscript of the Moses story. It looks like Sargon might have had company while floating down the river, because other heroic figures were also basket cases. As far away as India in the famous epic of Mahabharata, the demigod Karna was abandoned in a little ark that is drawn out of the Ganges River by the wife of a charioteer. Closer to Judea, the twin founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, placed in a trough and left afloat in the Tiber River, saved by landing in the branches of a fig tree and eventually rescued by friendly animals and then later by swineherd. How many baby heroes were getting their swimming lessons this way? Was it really the best way to save a baby, by having them float away to unknown places? If you think these are plausible biographies, then you might not be fit to be a parent. However, if you're like me and you see them as tropes in mythical stories, then you have to ask yourself, how is Moses any different? What could make the story of Moses' birth even more mythical? How about this? Moses was rescued by an Egyptian goddess. In the fan fiction written after Exodus, the gaps in the story are filled in. And one detail that had to be filled was the name of Pharaoh's daughter. Who was this woman who found and drew Moses out of the Nile? In the tradition preserved by Josephus, and in the Book of Jubilees, a book found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, her name was Thermuthis. That name is a form of the name of the snake deity Renunutet, often depicted sitting on a throne. She was a protector of the pharaoh from birth to death. Her name perhaps gives away her function, as the name Renunutet or Thermuthis comes from the verb that means to nurse. Perhaps then, no wonder the goddess of nursing would save and nurse the infant Moses. Oh, but the detail-minded among you will point out that in Exodus 2, 7-9, it is not Pharaoh's daughter who nurses the child, but amazingly, Moses' own mother. The same is true in Jubilees 47. And even this detail can be understood when looking at Egyptian religion at the time of composition. In that time, the cult of Thermuthis was combining with that of the goddess Isis, perhaps the most important goddess in Egyptian religion. In iconography, far more often is it Isis that nurses a child, and in those depictions of Isis nursing a babe, often the child is found on or in a basket. It seems then we might not have one, but two goddesses brought into the story of Moses' birth. Two goddesses that the Egyptians themselves had paired up. Jewish interpreters of Isis would say she was actually Eve, the mother of all living. So if Isis was associated with anything in Judaism, it was motherhood. Instead of being called Moshe, he should have been called Mashwe. There is indeed something strange with Moses' name. Scholars and commentators have noticed this for at least a millennium. We will come back to this later, but for now, we will pause to say that the story, as presented, does not make sense as history, and it has a strange plot hole. We will dive into that plot hole. But let's look at more of the story of Moses and see what else looks more like a legend than a sober account of history. Moses and the Hellenic hero. When it comes to what is historically likely, we already have good reason to doubt the story of Moses' birth, but it isn't like the Moses of the Bible was anything less than legendary. The outline of his story is in fact so standard, there's a name for it: the mythic hero archetype, or hero pattern. The most famous version of the hero pattern was published in the early 20th century by Fitzroy Richard Somerset, better known as Lord Raglan. He based his model first on the story of a famous drama of a Greek king of Thebes, the mother-loving Oedipus. Like other legends, the story of Oedipus also involves a birth under unusual circumstances, with the infant nearly put to death, but saved by chance or destiny, and reared by adoptive parents. He then returns to his kingdom, defeats a terrible monster, rules for a time, and then loses favor with the gods and his subjects, and finally dies a mysterious death in a faraway land. In fact, the gods personally see to his burial in a hidden place. Look at the hero pattern and how well Moses matches up. If you notice a green check on the right, then it matches in some way. And many green checks means, without a doubt, this is the main focus. Sometimes there's an X, which means we haven't found a match. On the left is the pattern element. The hero's mother is a royal virgin. His father is a king, often a near relative of his mother. Circumstances of his conception are unusual. He is reputed to be the son of a god. At birth, an attempt is made to kill him. He is spirited away, reared by foster parents in a far country. We are told nothing of his childhood. On reaching manhood, he returns or goes to his future kingdom after a victory over the king and or a giant dragon or wild beast. He marries a princess, often the daughter of his predecessor, becomes a king. For a time he reigns uneventfully, prescribed laws, of course. Later he loses favor with the gods and or his subjects, is driven from the throne and city. He meets with a mysterious death, often at the top of a hill. His children, if any, do not succeed him. His body is not buried. He has one or more holy scepters. As you can see, Moses fits the pattern almost perfectly, getting 20 of the 22 possible points. And that is only with the biblical account. The expansion of his story by Josephus and others makes him fit these points multiple times. If we compare this to other legendary figures, Moses is one of the highest scoring people in all of ancient literature. Oedipus fit 21 of the 22 criteria. The hero Theseus earned 20. The god Dionysus had 19. Romulus and Perseus both had 18. Heracles earned 17. Bellerophon had 16, while Jason and Zeus had 15. Yes, this means Moses' story even more slavishly follows legendary tropes than that of Hercules. When we apply the same scale to other biblical figures, there is no comparison. According to Raglan, Elijah could only have been said to have earned 9 points, while Joseph earned 12. As for historical people, even with wild legends attached to them, they do not score so high. Alexander the Great, who had fantastical novels devoted to him, only scored 7 points, as Raglan counted. It's almost like real people don't have stories with so many of these elements in their biography. Taking another dive into these heroic criteria, it is almost as if the writers of Exodus were trying to make Moses fit the pattern on purpose. Take his lineage. Moses' father, Amram, is a descendant of Levi, the founding father of the tribe of Levi. According to Exodus 6:16-20, Amram is the grandchild of Levi, but according to Numbers 26:59, Moses' mother, Jochebed, was the daughter of Levi himself. Okay, maybe the family tree of Moses is a little too similar to that in the Game of Thrones. However, let's step past the cringiness of this marriage. Whoever wrote this story also likely had the same sort of reaction as you did, and in the Greek translation of Exodus 6:20, Jochebed is made to be a cousin instead of an aunt of Amram, and yet the older Hebrew author wanted to tell the story that way. It's almost as if they knew that a hero needed to have such a strange family. Take, for example, King Oedipus, his mother Jocasta, and his father Laius, both descendants of the founder of Thebes, Cadmus. In this case, Laius was the great-grandson of Cadmus, while Jocasta was the great-great-granddaughter, as Oedipus would later marry his own mother and have children. There, you are looking at a tight-knit family tree. To mimic such an unusual genealogy in the case of Moses, with an even shorter number of branches between Moses' parents than in the case of Oedipus, and you have to think this was a conscious decision on the part of the writer, or else there were some decisions by the Levite family members that we might want to question, to put it mildly. We can also compare the death of Oedipus and that of Moses. Neither go down without a long series of speeches. In the play Oedipus at Colonus, written by Sophocles and performed in 401 BCE, the blind king comes to a small town outside of Athens to finally die. He makes several speeches and prophecies, sees signs from Zeus that the time has come, and then the hero, Theseus, personally leads him to a secret place to be buried, such that no one else would know where Oedipus's body was, and thus provides supernatural protection to Athens. Now look at Moses. In his dying days is told by God that he would not enter the promised land and would soon die. Moses then gives a long closing speech, the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, makes a final set of prophecies, and then dies in a hidden place under divine supervision. There seems to be a template followed between these death scenes, but we shouldn't claim to see genetic connections. Thematic connections, definitely. Structural similarities, sure. History? Let's back up a bit and look again at the larger pattern and some trends. What is telling here is that the hero pattern of Raglan is a better fit to mythical figures in Greece and Roman stories than those from Egypt or the Middle East. Southwest Asian figures like Gilgamesh do not score so high as Moses. For example, this hero archetype is especially Hellenistic. Even other biblical figures are not so like these Greek heroes as Moses. Is it just a coincidence that Moses is portrayed like a Hellenic hero? The numbers suggest a big no. Now, the parts of the pattern above are so widely applied in Western myths and legends that we cannot use it for genetic connection between Moses and any one such Greek figure. So if we want to get to the core of what the tales of Moses are about and where they come from, we must excavate even more. In the legendary DNA of this man, we can find a lineage of lore. Primary source for Exodus myth. A further indication that the story of Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt is a myth concerns the 40 years spent in the desert of Kadesh Barnea. According to the Bible, some 2 million people are able to wander around the desert for 40 years without finding their way out, and without starving or dying of thirst. They are provided with a magical substance called manna, itself a mythical trope, divine elixirs and golden apples, nectar of the gods, and peaches of immortality. Magical foodstuffs play important roles in mythology. It doesn't get any easier for someone seeking credibility in this extraordinary tale. We have archaeological evidence of Bedouin tribes at the time in Kadesh Barnea creating tent settlements and using a few tools and making fires. But we don't have any evidence of an entire population of Hebrews living and working as slaves in Egypt for all those years, breaking out whilst doing a whole host of miracles. all while there were 10 plagues ravaging the land after being in Babylon, which could be seen as a version of Egypt. Scattering the Israelites among the nations was a form of wilderness experience, as explicitly compared by the prophet Ezekiel. The authors living either in the Persian period or Hellenistic are anachronistically creating a history from creation down to their day, with several flags signaling what appears to be their experience with the nations of Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and Greece. For a modern analogy, the superhero film genre owes a great debt to movies like Superman 1978 and Batman 1989. Nowadays, it's hard to watch a superhero film without noticing elements or ideas that were popularized by these pioneering movies. Taking one last look at the works of Vasilius, he argues that there are notable parallels between the accounts of Xerxes' expedition against Greece in Herodotus' histories and the Exodus narrative about Moses in the Hebrew Bible. Both Xerxes and Moses are initially reluctant leaders who undertake campaigns at divine urging. The promised lands of Greece and Canaan are depicted as rich and fertile. Before their expeditions, both rulers experience portents like darkness and death of firstborn sons. The mustering of their armies is also described. The crossing of the Hellespont by Xerxes' army and the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites occur via miraculous dividing of the waters. Afterwards, the divinity is directly addressed. In the campaigns, Xerxes and Moses receive warnings about the difficulties ahead. There are parallels between the complaints of the Israelites and advice given to Xerxes. Provisioning the multitudes is a logistical challenge in both accounts. The Battle of Thermopylae corresponds to the battle with Amalek. The leaders observe from vantage points and are aided by relatives. Advice after Thermopylae may parallel Jethro's counsel to Moses on governance. Overall, he argues for literary connections between Herodotus' histories and the Pentateuch. With Xerxes' campaign structurally paralleling the Exodus narrative, he presents a detailed analysis of the correspondence. The cattle to the sun god. Turning now to Dr. Bruce Loudon, who received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He was super interested in ancient stories and myths from places like Greece and the Near East, as well as classic works from Shakespeare, Milton, and even some from India. He's passed away, but his ideas are still with us. He wrote a wonderful book called Homer's Odyssey in the Near East, which echoes much of what Dr. Philip Wagenbaum says about the Greek connections to the Bible. He highlights the significance of the 3 occurrences in the Bible of women at the well being betrothed, which includes Moses meeting Zipporah, and how this has parallel significance to Homer's Odyssey. Loudon highlights the mythological genre within these stories very well. He says myths are like stories, ancient stories, that use classic elements we see over and over, like scenes in a courtroom of gods or stories where someone unexpectedly hosts a very special guest. They also have common characters like heroes, gods, or wise old figures, just like we have different genres of movies today, like action, drama, or comedy. Myths also have genres or categories. When people hear a myth, they kind of know the general plot because they're familiar with the genre, but there are always little changes or local touches that make each one unique. Now we're going to show all the genre markers and parallel the myth of Moses and Odysseus from Homer's Odyssey. The comparisons are actually very shocking. Whether the Bible borrowed directly from the Odyssey to craft its Moses myth, some common source, or the elements are known to be floating in the air among people of the time, I don't know. I find the last one extremely unlikely, but you will see why in the end of this study. The comparisons are undeniable. Are you ready to have your mind blown? Let's begin. Imagine a captivating adventure where a leader with a strong connection to a god is guiding his people home. Along the way, his followers grow impatient, and while he's away, they break a major rule set by the god. When they're caught, now you might be thinking of the famous tale from ancient Greece, where the hero Odysseus and his crew face numerous challenges on their journey home. Or you might be thinking of the story of Moses from the Old Testament, leading the Israelites from Egypt. Interestingly, in Odysseus' tale, his crew rebels while on an island called Thrinakia. with cattle to the sun god Apollo, leading to a major disaster. This event is quite similar to when the Israelites, in Moses' absence, create and worship a golden calf, angering their god, Yahweh. Both leaders, Moses and Odysseus, have a very close relationship with the deity and play no part in their followers' rebellious acts. Yet, while the disobedient followers face divine wrath, the leaders are spared. However, there are important differences too. For instance, while Moses' people are traveling to a new home, Odysseus and his crew are trying to return to their old home. Moses is seen as a prophet, whereas Odysseus is a warrior and hero. Despite these differences, both stories touch on religious themes. They highlight the dangers of disrespecting gods and the consequences of breaking divine rules. The tales remind us of ancient beliefs about the power of gods and how they must be respected. What's fascinating is that by comparing these two tales, we can better understand each story and the cultures they come from. There's also a historical connection. Then Moses led his people away from Egypt around the same time the Greeks believed they had defeated Troy. In both stories, leaders, Odysseus and Moses, are shown to have a unique and close bond with the gods, unlike their followers who don't share this same connection. In the tale of Odysseus, even though some parts of the story show him tackling challenges alone, he's frequently guided and helped by the gods. For instance, Zeus, the top god, makes a notable mention about him, and Athena, a powerful goddess, often steps in to assist him. He even gets a direct visit and guidance from the god Hermes. All these events highlight how Odysseus is different from his crewmates, who don't have such divine interactions. Sticking to this theme, Odysseus often follows the gods' advice. Whether it's Hermes guiding him on how to deal with Circe, or Circe directing him on his journey to the underworld, he listens. So when he's told not to harm the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, it's in line with his character to obey. With Moses, it's clear he has a unique bond with God known as Yahweh. Right from when he hears God's voice from a burning bush to the numerous times God guides him on handling the pharaoh, their special connection stands out. For instance, when Moses is unsure about speaking to his people, God reassures him, promising to guide his words. Interestingly, a similar theme pops up in the tale of Odysseus. Here, it's not Odysseus, but his son Telemachus, who's hesitant to speak before an elder, Nestor. Athena, a goddess, steps in to comfort and guide Telemachus, just like she does for his father throughout their journey. Going back to Moses, the difference between his close relationship with God and the more distant one the Israelites share with him becomes even more obvious. At one point, God asks Moses to come up a mountain alone to receive special teachings, making it clear others can't join. Moses does so, disappearing into a cloud, leaving everyone else behind. In both cases, there's a forced pause in the journey, which makes the travelers restless. This pause becomes crucial because both groups, the crew with Odysseus and the Israelites with Moses, had already shown some rebellious tendencies. This stop only heightens the tension they feel towards their leaders. What's more, even though their actual destinations aren't that far away, it takes them years to get there. This delay becomes a small reflection of the bigger challenges they face on their journeys. Interestingly, the time they're stuck is about the same for both. A month for Odysseus' crew and 40 days for the Israelites. Both these time frames are symbolic and often come up in their respective myths. It won't be a shock that in the Exodus and Odyssey, we see strange weather patterns, believed to be caused by the gods, play a significant role in delaying the travelers. In the Odyssey, after Odysseus and his crew reached Thrinacia, strong winds stopped them from leaving. Similarly, Menelaus finds himself stuck on an island called Pharos, when there's no wind at all. He's trapped there 20 days. Runs out of food, and his men become desperate with hunger. Back on Thrinacia, once the crew arrives and settles down for dinner, a huge storm breaks out. This storm is described in a way that's reminiscent of an earlier storm in their journey. These two storms are interconnected in the narrative. The first storm hints that the journey home won't be easy, while the last one foreshadows a tragic end, as many of the crew members never make it home. These fierce winds continue for a month, and just like with Menelaus, Odysseus's crew runs out of food and becomes very hungry. With the Exodus story, dramatic weather events believed to be acts of gods are frequently depicted. Examples include a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night guiding the Israelites, and the heavy cloud, thunder, and lightning that surround God's appearance on Mount Sinai. Just before a key moment of rebellion, the Israelites see Moses as he's called by God from a cloud on a mountain. After this, Moses disappears into this cloud, remaining hidden for 40 days. In the expansive Exodus narrative, there's a noticeable trend among followers to distance themselves from their deity. This distancing foreshadows their eventual revolt against the deity and mirrors their inclination to challenge their respective leaders. Both narratives have earlier instances of such defiance, setting the stage for pivotal moments in Odyssey 12 and Odysseus's crew right from the prologue, stressing that they meet their doom due to their own recklessness, even as Odysseus endeavors to rescue them. The fable of the Odyssey illustrates the crew's rebellious nature in 3 distinct episodes, which culminate in a full-blown mutiny in Thrinakia. The stop at Ismaros acts as a microcosm of the crew's predisposition towards revolt, setting the scene for the events at Thrinakia. Here, after they have plundered the city of the Sycones, Odysseus urges them to depart, yet they remain defiant, choosing to feast by killing numerous sheep and cattle. This decision allows the Sycones to gather reinforcements and launch a retaliatory attack, which claims the lives of 72 crew members. Their demise is a direct consequence of their disregard for Odysseus's instructions, combined with their impulsive choice to feast in a potentially hazardous environment. This act of overindulgence and lack of restraint foreshadows their later actions on Thrinakia. During their voyage away from Aeolus Island, when they are within sight of Ithaca, a crew member without any solid proof convinces his peers that Odysseus is secretly keeping treasures from them. While Odysseus is asleep, this crew member opens the bag given by Aeolus, releasing stormy winds and sending them back to the island. Much like in Thrinakia, a single crew member instigates a rebellion against Odysseus, resulting in the loss of their chance to return home. This rebellion is notably executed while Odysseus is resting, a circumstance that recurs in Thrinakia. In another foreshadowing instance, Eurylochus tries to discourage the crew from accompanying Odysseus back to Circe. Even though he's unsuccessful here, Eurylochus positions himself as a representative of dissent, embodying the voice of those who will later rebel in Thrinakia. The next significant act of insubordination happens as the crew lands on Thrinakia, drawing them closer to Helios's sacred cattle. Both Tiresias and Circe had cautioned Odysseus against harming these cattle. Some scholars critique the repetitiveness of these warnings, yet few ponder its intentional impact. When Circe echoes Tiresias's warning, the prohibition against harming the cattle elevates to a divine edict, akin to the biblical command in Genesis forbidding the consumption from the tree of knowledge. Infringing upon such a divine command usually leads to grave penalties, often death, as exemplified by Lot's wife in the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. Aware of these consequences, Odysseus advises against docking at Thrinakia. However, Eurylochus, disregarding the cautions, contends they should eat on the island, given their fatigue. Acknowledging the impending mutiny, Odysseus makes the crew swear they won't harm Helios's cattle. In the Exodus narrative, there are previous instances where the Israelites challenge Moses, foreshadowing their major uprising in Exodus 32:11. Initially, when Moses approaches Pharaoh to request permission for the Israelites to engage in their religious ceremony, Pharaoh retaliates by increasing their workload. Interestingly, the Israelites lay the blame on Moses, not Pharaoh, for their augmented troubles. This marks the inaugural questioning of Moses' leadership, which is a crisis that develops around the challenge to Moses' leadership in Exodus 5:20-21. When Pharaoh later chases the Israelites to the Red Sea, they again reproach Moses, expressing regret and wishing they had perished in Egypt instead. Upon their arrival at Marah, faced with only bitter waters, their grievances are once more directed at Moses. Notably, while journeying through the wilderness of Sin, merely 2 months after their Egyptian exodus, their hunger evokes complaints reminiscent of the crew's unrest in Thrinakia. They lament,
"If only we had died at the Lord's hand in Egypt, where he sat by the flesh pots and had plenty of bread. But you have brought us into this wilderness to let this whole assembly starve to death." Exodus 16:3.
Each grievance of the Israelites is reminiscent of the complaints voiced by Odysseus' crew on Thrinakia, particularly their fear of impending starvation. This mirrors Eurylochus' bleak perspective, where he states that perishing from hunger is the worst kind of death. Subsequent to these events, when the Israelites set up camp at Rephidim and are unable to find water, a fresh conflict emerges between them and Moses concerning their thirst. Moses perceives their defiance against him as tantamount to rebelling against God, posing the question, "Why do you dispute with me? Why do you challenge the Lord?" In several narratives, the absence of a leader plays a pivotal role in the ensuing insurrection. This is evident in the tale where, unable to depart from Thrinakia for a span of 30 days, Odysseus isolates himself from his crew to seek divine intervention. Such a circumstance offers an opportune moment for the crew to defy his instructions, seeking to further their own interests. However, it would be incorrect to suggest that Odysseus bears the blame for their mutiny. As some scholars occasionally assert, this perspective seemingly overlooks Zeus's fundamental proclamation on the liability of mortals. Additionally, it fails to recognize the thematic likenesses the Odyssey draws between the crew and the suitors, especially their engagement in rash deeds pinpointed by Zeus. Both entities exhibit a thematic lack of restraint, which will be further elaborated upon. Conversely, the absence of Odysseus provides insights into his character and how he stands apart from his crew. Modern readers might be taken aback by these traits, but Odysseus' pursuit of divine guidance reflects his moral compass and leadership's wisdom, emphasizing the captain's devotion and virtuous aspirations. Further, as Stanford remarks,
The choice of Odysseus to commune with the deities in seclusion mirrors the tendencies of a Hebrew prophet more so than the collective and ritualistic spiritual practices of the Homeric hero.
In Exodus 32, the prolonged absence of Moses is what agitates the Israelites, a scenario reminiscent of Thrinakia, where the crew's restlessness precedes Odysseus' solitary quest for prayer due to the winds. The correlation between Moses' absence and the Israelites' subsequent defiance is delineated more overtly than in the Odyssey, as illustrated by the phrase, "The people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain." Moses' absence spans 40 days, and within this time frame in Exodus 24, when he departs to converse with Yahweh until his return in chapter 32, the Old Testament authors interpose an episode which doesn't directly pertain to the insurrection. The narrative of Moses' divine engagement atop the mountain, as captured between Exodus 25 to 31, synthesizes two mythological structures, Anabasis and the visionary experience. Moses' ascent, or going up, referred to as an anabasis in the Septuagint, is analogous to a celestial journey. As Moses scales the peak, he metaphorically nears the heavens. Here, he is endowed with a modified visionary experience, with Yahweh serving as his otherworldly mentor. In both tales, the leader's absence stems from their engagement or attempt to communicate with the divine, as seen with Moses and Odysseus, while their respective followers act in defiance of their deity's intent. In In moments of exacerbated impatience, people often seek alternative leaders who, in the absence of a direct connection to the divine, tend to oppose sacred edicts to fulfill the demands of the disappointed. Eurylochos exhibits such tendencies on numerous occasions. He is believed to be the unidentified crew member who tempts fate by opening Aeolus's bag, a transgression that notably occurs during Odysseus' slumber. Eurylochos directly confronts Odysseus on Aiaia and plays a pivotal role in the decision to dock at Thrinakia. In Exodus 32, Aaron, Moses' sibling, and the high priest tasked with leading sacrificial rites, steps into this surrogate leadership role. It's essential to note that Aaron was not originally a frontrunner amongst the disgruntled. In previous narratives, he was in fact a target of their rage. The Israelites fault him and Moses for their predicaments with Pharaoh and for their tribulations en route to Canaan. However, it's during their prolonged stay at Mount Sinai's base and the protracted absence of Moses that Aaron rises as the leader of the dissenting group. The disparity in behavior, Eurylochos' recurrent confrontations with Odysseus in contrast to Aaron's loyalty to Moses up until Exodus 32, becomes more pronounced when assessing their eventual destinies in the culmination of their respective myths. Both protagonists in the narrative share the trait of having a relative in a secondary leadership role. Eurylochus shares family ties with Odysseus, being connected through marriage as highlighted in Odysseus' recounting. This bond becomes particularly significant when Odysseus contemplates retribution against Eurylochus for attempting to deter the crew from journeying to Circe's abode. Despite the degree of kinship not being as close as that of Aaron and Moses, the fundamental sentiment remains consistent. It is unexpected for a relative to exhibit disloyalty to the main leader. Aaron's introduction into Moses' overarching narrative comes notably late. His emergence is only recorded post Moses' marriage and extended tenure with the Midianites. Specifically, it's upon the conclusion of the burning bush episode where Yahweh designates Aaron as Moses' spokesperson. Interestingly, while Moses' sister gets a mention, albeit without a name, in the primary narrative, Aaron's conspicuous absence, despite his significant involvement later on, is intriguing. Some scholars underscore this delayed introduction, remarking on the absence of prior mention of Aaron, saying no previous report of Aaron's existence had been made. The apparent contradictions in Aaron's portrayal, ranging from being a leader of the dissenters to the progenitor of the priestly lineage, could likely be attributed to the merging of disparate narratives, resulting in certain incongruities. Prior to significant divergencies in their narratives, both Eurylochus and Aaron are portrayed as collaborators with the primary protagonists. Eurylochus, although frequently portrayed as confronting or opposing Odysseus, also aids him on several occasions, especially in religious rituals. In the realm of Hades, Eurylochus, along with another crew member, Paramedes, helps with the sacrifice of 2 rams in line with Circe's guidance, following her previous directions. When they later confront the Sirens, it is Circe's explicit instructions that save them, detailing how Odysseus can listen to their song yet remain unscathed, emphasizing that should he request to be released, his bindings should instead be tightened. When the song's allure proves irresistible to Odysseus, it is Paramedes and Eurylochus who enforce his bindings, following Circe's divine commands, evoking the ritualistic nature of the event akin to the Hades sacrifice. In the same vein, Aaron, in relation to Moses, echoes Eurylochus' relationship with Odysseus. Though he later spearheads the rebellion in Exodus 32, Aaron's earlier representations depict him harmoniously collaborating with Moses. His inaugural mention in Exodus reveals Yahweh's intention for the brothers to act in concert, with Aaron as Moses' mouthpiece. Throughout Moses' engagements with Pharaoh, Aaron consistently partners with him, showcasing their collaborative spirit. As the inaugural high priest of Israel, Aaron's intimate involvement in sacrificial rites is evident. Their collaborative endeavors peak when they jointly petition Pharaoh for permission to conduct a sacrifice to Yahweh. When Pharaoh's subsequent denial, Aaron's capacities are highlighted as he executes a series of miraculous acts, including transforming the Nile's waters to blood. These acts intriguingly foreshadow his capability to fashion the golden calf later on. disrespecting the divine. In his desire to avoid death by starvation, considered the most tragic demise, Eurylochus suggests slaughtering the prime cattle of Helios as an offering to the gods of Olympus. He then proposes to perform rites in honor of Helios once they return home. The transgression is artfully concealed within the framework of ritual practices, with Odysseus away in slumber. Eurylochus and the rest of the crew proceed to seize several of Helios's cattle. They offer prayers before slaughtering, skinning, and roasting the animals, committing a profound sacrilege. In a parallel narrative, certain Israelites resembling the most unnamed crew members of Odysseus, save for Paramedes, approach Aaron with a request to create and venerate idols not dedicated to Yahweh. Heeding their wishes, Aaron collects their gold earrings and crafts the golden calf, even constructing an altar to worship it. This act of using gold jewelry can be traced back to an earlier episode in Egypt where the Israelites had acquired gold and silver ornaments from their neighbors. Although Exodus 32, 2-3 specifically cites the nose rings as the source for the golden calf, the following events are marked by a day-long feast where they sat down to eat and drink and later engaged in festivity. Scholars draw attention to the disparity between this ritualistic behavior and their subsequent hedonism, highlighting that
the people's actions mimic the covenant's formulation in chapter 24, which also encompass sacrifice and a holy meal in the presence of a discernible deity.
In both myths, there's an association with the same animal type, whether it's a cow, bull, or a calf. While these animals are commonly used in sacrificial rites and represented as divine symbols, this similarity, albeit broad, provides yet another parallel. In Exodus 32, the bovine representation of the idol adds a layer of mockery. Having encountered Yahweh, the Israelites revert to venerating a deity linked to an animal form. This serves as a reflection of the shared sacrificial traditions between the Greeks and Israelites, evident throughout the Mosaic text. We must emphasize that the dissenters are actually conscious of the transgressions they are undertaking. Tiresias forewarns of the crew's doom if they harm Helios's cattle. Notably, both Eurylochus and Paramedes are present during this prophecy alongside Odysseus. Later, as they sail past Thrinacia, Odysseus conveys the essence of Tiresias' warning to the entire crew, eliciting from them an oath to refrain from killing any ox or sheep, which they duly swear. The gravity of infringing upon Helios' cattle is not lost on them. Eurylochus' own words when advocating for the consumption of the cattle attest to his comprehension of the peril. Despite being fully apprised of the consequences, they consciously decide they'd prefer perishing at sea over succumbing to hunger on Thrinacia, and their wish is tragically granted. In the context of the Old Testament, given the relentless critiques against venerating any deity other than Yahweh, the Israelites would undoubtedly recognize, even if subconsciously, that they're partaking in apostasy. This apostate act is thematically known to elicit Yahweh's anger, as particularly emphasized in Exodus 25. Both myths incorporate discussions regarding temple construction. In the Odyssey, while persuading the crew to sacrifice some of Helios' cattle, Eurylochus promises to construct a temple in honor of the god upon their safe arrival. Such a subject is infrequently broached in Homeric epics. Alfred Hubeck elaborates. Mentions of dedicating temples are especially noteworthy in Homer, considering there are hardly any mentions of Greek temples, save for one, the Temple of Athena at Athens, and another at Troy. And among the Phoenicians, historically, Dark Age Greeks began constructing temples relatively later, perhaps influenced by external cultures. Eurylochus' commitment, juxtaposed with his urging to harm the god's sacred livestock, exudes a sense of thoughtless contradiction. Meanwhile, the Exodus narrative in the chapters preceding 32 extensively details the blueprint of the tabernacle and its associated offerings. Though presented distinctively, this is another shared motif between the myths, strategically positioned in their respective narratives. Eurylochus' envisioned temple is opulent, filled with agomata, or offerings pleasing to the gods. These could be sacrifices, artifacts, or even idols. The Septuagint's translation also utilizes agalmata in similar contexts. The terms inaugural, mentioned in the Odyssey, sheds light on its versatility. Agistos, drawing parallels to the suitors and the crew post-sacrificing animals, presents agalmata, comprising gold and woven artifacts, as tokens of appreciation for winning Clytemnestra's affection. Like Eurylochus, Aegisthus offers agalmata, subsequent to deeds frowned upon by the gods, as emphasized by Zeus. When Nestor identifies Athena's prior presence, he pledges a gilded horned yearling cow as a sacrifice to her. This offering, later meticulously detailed, is identified as an agalmata for Athena, echoing the gilded calf idol in Exodus 32. The Odyssey's sole portrayal of the Trojan horse from the Trojans' viewpoint offers intriguing parallels. The Trojans, after some contemplation, consider the wooden horse a divine agalmata and usher it into their city, mirroring the Israelites in Exodus 32. The Trojans, in linking this wooden representation to deities, inadvertently seal their fate. Odysseus and Moses discern the indiscretions of their people from afar upon their return. As Odysseus wakes up and makes his way back to the ship, he detects the aroma of roasting meat even before reaching his crew. Argonauts of the Desert, Philip Wagenbaum's Greek influence. In a previous episode on the origin of Abraham, we examined the Greek Argonautica myth with a concise breakdown of the Phrixus myth and an integral observation highlighted in the 10th step. Here's the story. Athamas, the Boeotian king, weds Nephele, a cloud deity crafted in Hera's likeness by Zeus. The couple produces twin offspring, Phrixus and Helle. Athamas later forsakes Nephele in favor of Ino. Ino harbors malice towards her stepchildren and conspires their demise at the hands of their own progenitor. Ino manipulates messengers to convince King Athamas that Phrixus's sacrifice at Mount Lephistion was mandated by the Delphic oracle to alleviate a prevailing famine. On the verge of the tragic act, a divine intervention, either by Zeus or Nephele, presents a golden winged ram, whisking both children to safety. Helle's unfortunate plunge mid-flight gives rise to the naming of the Hellespont. Phrixus safely reaches Colchis, modern-day Georgia, aboard the ram. In deep reverence, Phrixus offers the savior ram to Zeus and commemorates the act by placing its golden fleece upon an oak. An often overlooked facet, yet of paramount importance, is the myth's introduction to the Argonauts saga, who subsequently venture to Colchis to reclaim the illustrious golden fleece. Drawing parallels with Genesis 22's account of Isaac's binding, God challenges Abraham's fidelity, mandating him to offer his cherished son atop Mount Moriah. Abraham obliges, tying down his son. Divine intervention by an angel halts the ritual in its tracks. A ram, entangled in a bush, becomes Abraham's alternate sacrifice. However, a nuanced distinction emerges. The Hellenic tale witnesses the ram's demise, followed by the display of its fleece on a tree. Contrarily, the biblical narrative portrays the ram's initial ensnarement, followed by its sacrifice. This deviation raises speculation over the tale's potential shared origin, derivative nature, or mere coincidental similarities. A deeper exploration into their respective narrative contexts, the Argonautic epic and the biblical recount, will provide further clarity. Both dads were deeply faithful and ready to follow a divine command without question. Just as things looked grim, a magical ram appeared to save the day. In Isaac's story, the command came directly to his father. In Phrixus's, the command was for him. This ram got tangled in some bushes or trees before it was sacrificed for Isaac, but after it saved Phrixus. and the ram was sacrificed to spare Isaac's life and as a thank you for saving Phrixus. What's fascinating is how these story parts could easily be mixed and matched to make new tales. So a big question emerges: are these stories just eerily similar by chance, or did one story inspire the other? One detail that stands out is the ram in the bushes. It's unique enough to make us really ponder if there's a connection between the two stories. Now here's something to consider. While some might find it a bit controversial, many scholars believe parts of the Old Testament were written pretty late in history. Considering how closely Jewish and Greek cultures were during this period, it's possible they influenced each other's stories. Interestingly, both these tales of narrow escapes from sacrifice start bigger stories that share themes. 1. Both have divine promises about land inheritance. 2. Both speak of special chosen people. 3. They mention a 4-generation wait time before the land's acquired. 4. A leader who's a bit hesitant due to a stutter helps the people. 5. Both tales have unexpected delays due to human mistakes. 6. The stories include desert journeys with sacred items. 7. Along the way, they get divine messages or guidance. These tales are more than just thrilling beginnings. They're foundation stones for the larger stories. Both narratives frequently circle back to these tales, reminding the reader of the divine promises and how everything began. The Bible isn't just about the descendants of Abraham getting a piece of land called Canaan. Philip Wagenbaum points out how similar the Bible stories are to what Plato wrote. For starters, both talk about a big flood that changed the world and was followed by a time when patriarchs ruled. They mention the growth of cities, how kings came to be, the birth of laws, and even describe an ideal world. Surprisingly, the Bible's laws often sound a lot like Plato's ideas. Both stress having a central religious power. They emphasize the importance of pure blood, especially for religious leaders. They aren't fans of things like same-sex relationships, witchcraft, or magic. Both have rules about inheriting property, setting up boundary markers, and where slaves can come from. Both divide the ideal state into 12 parts, each given to a different tribe or group. They warn that kings can get caught up in their own desires, which could make them cruel rulers. Think of the mistakes made by David and Solomon in the Bible. Wagenbaum uses a special way of analyzing stories first introduced by Claude Levi-Strauss to look at the Bible. His findings are vast, and this is just a peek. One notable comparison is between the near sacrifices of Phrixus and Isaac in their stories. The tale of Phrixus sets the stage for the adventures of Jason and the Argonauts, which explain the origins of a Greek settlement in North Africa. The tales of Argonauts and the Bible simplified. Both rich in drama and destiny. One is about the Argonauts, an adventurous group from ancient Greece. Their leader, Jason, belongs to a family line that once tried, but failed, to sacrifice someone named Phrixus. To calm down an angry god named Zeus, the Argonauts go on a quest to find a golden fleece, basically the shiny skin of the ram that once saved Phrixus. While on this quest, an Argonaut gets some soil from the sea god's son, which is like a future land ownership certificate. This chunk of land will later become Cyrene, but there's a catch. If the soil was kept safe, his descendants would move there soon. But since it was lost at sea, they'd wait many generations, settling somewhere else first. What's interesting, the order of events is flipped in a familiar Bible story. Abraham is first told his descendants will get land. Only after this does he nearly sacrifice his son Isaac. Fast forward in the Argonaut story, and a guy named Battus, a descendant of the Argonauts, gets a divine order to lead his people to Cyrene. Battus tries to wiggle out of this, saying he's not brave and has a speech issue, but destiny won't let him off the hook. He ends up leading his people for 40 years. This reminds many of the biblical Moses. Moses, too, hesitated because of his speech problem, and then led his people for 40 years. So what's the takeaway? It's not just that there's a passing resemblance between Phrixus and Isaac. It's more profound. The whole narrative structure of these stories seem to echo each other. There's a curious interplay where events in one tale mirror those in another. But sometimes in a reversed order. Some say this isn't just coincidence. Given how stories traveled and evolved in ancient times, there's a chance these tales influenced each other in intriguing ways.
The cycle of Abraham shows similarities to the epic of the Argonauts. Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac to Yahweh, but an angel stopped him at the last moment. Instead of his son, Abraham sacrificed a ram, which he found stuck in a thicket by its horns. Yahweh then renewed the promise that Abraham's descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, Genesis 22. Quite similarly, Athamas, king of Boeotia, almost sacrificed his son Phrixus to Zeus. But a winged golden ram took Phrixus on its back and brought him safe to Colchis. And there Phrixus sacrificed it to Zeus and hung its golden fleece on an oak tree. See Herodotus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Apollodorus' Library, Aeginus's Fables. One generation later, Jason and the Argonauts set sail to Colchis to bring the golden fleece back to Greece. On the way back, while the Argonauts were stranded on the coast of Libya, Euphemus receives a promise by the god Triton that his descendants would inherit the land of Cyrene. Generations later, Battus, a descendant of Euphemus, consulted the oracle of Delphi about his stutter. The voice of the god Apollo ordered him to take the descendants of Euphemus to the promised land of Cyrene. Although Battus first protested that he did not feel up to this task and that he stuttered, he eventually led his people to Cyrene and ruled over them for 40 years. See Pindar, Pythian, Herodotus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Argonautica.
Dr. Vajenbaum has a fascinating theory. A playwright named Euripides added his own spin in his play called Helen. In this version, Helen was looked after by King Proteus, but after the king died, his son, Theoclymenus, fell for Helen. Even though Helen was already married, he wanted to marry her. But Helen wasn't having any of it and decided to stay near Proteus's grave for protection.
Helen. Now, as long as Proteus gazed upon yon glorious sun, I was safe from marriage. But when o'er him the dark grave closed, the dead man's son was eager for my hand. But I, from regard to my former husband, am throwing myself down in suppliant wise before his tomb of Proteus, praying him to guard my husband's honor, that though through Hellas I bear a name dishonored, at least my body here may not incur disgrace. Euripides, Helen.
After coming back from Troy, Menelaus ends up on the shores of Egypt. He hears that his wife is nearby, so he finds her and they reunite. Together they make a plan to escape Egypt, all the while fearing that the local king might try to harm Menelaus because of his feelings for her.
Helen speaks. Escape and fly with all thy speed from this land. Thou wilt be slain by him whose house this is. Menelaus. What have I done to merit such a fate? Helen. Thou hast arrived unexpectedly to thwart my marriage. Menelaus. What? Is some man bent on wedding my wife? Helen. Aye, and on heaping those insults on me which I have hitherto endured. Menelaus. Is he some private prince or ruler of this land? Helen. The son of Proteus, king of the country. Of course thou knowest then all about my marriage. Menelaus. I do, but whether thou hast escaped thy lover, I know not. Helen. Be well assured I have kept my body chaste. Helen, 780-95.
Helen and Menelaus come up with a clever plan to get out of Egypt. Menelaus acts like a Greek soldier, making up a story that their ship was wrecked and that Menelaus sadly didn't survive. Believing Helen to be now single, Theoclymenus thinks he has a chance to marry her. The couple then asks to perform a special ritual by the sea to honor the dead Menelaus, as is the Greek tradition. Theoclymenus, excited at the thought of marrying Helen, quickly agrees. The play takes a humorous twist as the pharaoh tries to show respect for Greek traditions, but it's clear he's mainly thinking about marrying Helen. In a funny moment, Menelaus cheekily asks the pharaoh for all sorts of items for the ritual, including a ship and weapons, hinting at his warrior reputation. Theoclymenus gets a bit anxious about it all.
Theoclymenus. How far from the shore does the ship put out? Menelaus. So far that the foam in her wake can scarce be seen from the strand. Theo. Why so? Wherefore doth Hellas observe this custom? Menelaus. That the billow may not cast up again our expiatory offerings. Theo. Phoenician rowers will soon cover the distance. Menelaus. 'Twill be well done and gratifying to Menelaus too. Theo. Canst thou not perform these rites well enough without Helen? Menelaus. This task belongs to mother, wife, or children. Theo. 'Tis her task then, according to thee, to bury her husband. Menelaus. To be sure, piety demands that the dead be not robbed of their due. Helen. 1265 to 80.
On the ship, Menelaus and his crew overpower the sailors and make a daring escape from Egypt. When Theoclymenus hears of this, he's furious and wants to chase them down. But suddenly, Helen's brothers, Castor and Pollux, show up. They tell Theoclymenus that higher powers wanted Menelaus and Helen to get away, that he should avoid doing something wrong. This part of the play, where they make a dramatic exit from Egypt, reminds us of other famous escapes, like the one in the Bible where the Israelites leave Egypt. Similarly, the story where the pharaoh falls for a married woman who eventually goes back to her husband can be compared to a couple of the tales from the Bible. There's one about Abram and Sarah in Egypt, and another about a king named Abimelech. One cool detail in the play, Castor and Pollux step in to tell Theoclymenus that he's about to make a big mistake with Helen. This is a lot like the part in the Bible when God appears in a dream to warn Abimelech about Sarah being a married woman. It's interesting how these ancient stories can have so many similarities.
Dioscuri. Restrain those bursts of rage that hurry thee to undue lengths. Theoclymenus, king of this country, we are the twin sons of Zeus that call to thee by name, whom Leda bore one day, with Helen too, who hath fled from thy palace, for thou art wroth for marriage never destined for thee. Long, long ago had we our sisters saved, seeing that Zeus had made us gods. But we were too weak for destiny, as well as the deities, who willed these things to be. Helen, 1650 to 60.
While Greek stories don't talk about Abraham pretending his wife is his sister, there's a fascinating similarity between the tale of Menelaus and Helen running from Egypt and the biblical Exodus story. Here's the gist. Moses tries to fool Pharaoh, but Pharaoh isn't too keen on the idea. He faces splitting the Red Sea. Remember how the tale of Joseph reminded some of Odysseus' make-believe journey to Egypt? Odysseus, in his tale, talks about how he went to Egypt after the famous Trojan War. Although he instructed his crew not to harm the locals, they didn't listen. They attacked the Egyptian men and kidnapped their women and kids. As you can guess, this angered the Egyptians.
The alarm was soon carried to the city, and when they heard the war cry, the people came at daybreak, till the plain was filled with horsemen and foot soldiers, and with the gleam of armor. Then Zeus spread panic among my men, and they would no longer face the enemy, for they found themselves surrounded. The Egyptians killed many of us, and took the rest alive to do forced labor for them. Odyssey, Book 14.
In the biblical story, Pharaoh gears up to chase the Israelites with his mighty army.
So he had his chariot made ready, and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites, who were going out boldly. The Egyptians pursued them, the Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. They overtook them, camped by the sea, by Pihorth, in front of Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Exodus 14, 6-10.
But when the Egyptians try to follow, Moses waves his hands again, the sea comes crashing back down, drowning the Egyptians. Funny enough, there's a pretty similar story mentioned by the ancient historian Herodotus.
When 3 months had gone by while Artabazos was besieging the town, there came to be a great ebb of the sea backwards, which lasted for a long time, and the barbarians, seeing that shallow water had been produced, endeavored to get by into the peninsula of Pallene. But when they had passed through 2/5 parts of the distance, and yet 3/5 remained, which they must pass through before they were in the Pallene, then there came upon them a great flood tide of the sea, higher than ever before, as the natives natives of the place say, though, high tides come often. So those of them who could not swim perished, and those who could were slain by the men of Potadia, who put out to them in boats. The cause of the high tide and flood, and of that which befell the Persians, was this, as the Potadians say, namely that these same Persians who perished by means of the sea had committed impiety towards the temple of Poseidon and his image in the suburb of their town. And in saying that this was the cause, in my opinion, they say well. The survivors of his army, Artabazos, led away to Thessaly to join Mardonius, Herodotus, Book 8.
The Bible's author blended together Odysseus' adventures in Egypt and a story by Herodotus about waters that briefly pulled back, all to enrich the Exodus tale, which was also influenced by a play called Helen by Euripides. On top of all this, they sprinkled in some ideas from the philosopher Plato. It's like a mixtape of ancient stories and thoughts. The Exodus and Plato's Cave Allegory, a scholarly interpretation. In The Republic, Book 7, Plato channeling Socrates delineates a profound allegory where individuals have been bound in a subterranean cavern for their entire existence. Their perceptions are confined to the cave's interior wall, upon which the mere silhouettes of external realities are cast. Intriguingly, when one of these captives is liberated and exposed to the genuine external world, the sheer brilliance of truth becomes almost blinding. Gradually, this individual discerns that the realities within the cave were mere representations of the actual world outside. The solar radiance symbolizes the idea of the good, expressing compassion for his peers, who misconstrue the shadows for divine entities. Socrates argues that the enlightened one should re-enter the cave to emancipate his peers. Nevertheless, this altruistic act might be met with derision or even aggression from those still ensnared by ignorance. This narrative epitomizes Plato's theory of forms, suggesting our tangible world is but a shadow of a more profound, intangible reality. This superior reality, however, is elusive, accessible solely to philosophers who fathom the quintessential idea of the good, symbolically representing the supreme deity as further elaborated in Plato's Timaeus. There's an interesting parallelism between the Platonic cave allegory and the Exodus narrative. The Israelites, thriving in numbers, are enslaved by a new pharaoh. Moses, eluding this subjugation, seeks refuge in Midian. It is here that he receives a divine revelation, and then came the frogs. This may show the original divide between land and sea is breaking down. The amphibious creature is no longer merely a water animal, but now coming out of the Nile and infesting the land. The primordial ordering of the place of animals is slipping away. On to the third plague with gnats. Here, the gnats specifically are transformed from the dust of the ground after Moses had struck the land. Note in particular, the gnats don't merely come out of the ground, but dust transforms into insects. The dust of the land becoming a plague is a straightforward reversal of life of animals, and especially humans, who were created from dust. Then comes the flies as the fourth plague. You might think if everyone is already covered in gnats, there won't be much room for flies as well. However, the flies are also said to fill the land. They seem to have fruitfully multiplied, but to the detriments to the Egyptians. God had said in Genesis 1:22 to want flying creatures multiply in the land, and so here they are. These three plagues also form an interesting triad. Frogs, gnats, and flies represent water, land, and sky. All is filled with destruction for the Egyptians. The next plague, pestilence, was inflicted not on people, but only field animals. This finds itself reversing Genesis 2:18-20, wherein animals are created for the benefit of humans. Well, that benefit is now dying around the Egyptians. All the while, the Israelites are avoiding the punishments meted out by Yahweh. The sixth plague, that of boils, is directly at humans, and it may be best understood as making the Egyptians impure. This does not seem to obviously parallel the Genesis account, but it does make the Egyptians no longer special and holy. The introduction of the plague also has some creation imagery, as Moses takes up dust and throws it into the air to infect the Egyptians with boils. Once again, dust and anti-creation are combined. When we turn to the seventh and eighth plagues, hail and locusts, they are the destruction of vegetation. As the animals have been killed off, then the plants would be the next part of the original creation to be undone. Exodus 10:15 states that after these plagues,
nothing green was left of tree or grass of the field in all the land of Egypt.
Again, a powerful reversal of Genesis 1:12.
The land brought forth vegetation, seed bearing fruit with seed in it.
If we are following the reverse of creation so far, then we are back to the original things made by God. Light as separate from darkness, and so the 9th plague is darkness in all the land. For 3 days, the original order of day and night is gone. In fact, darkness was even more severe, as the Egyptians could not even see each other, while the Israelites had their own lights. Not only was the sun gone, but light itself was no longer in the land for the Egyptians. This was a powerful return to the beginning state of the universe, when darkness was over the face of the deep. Last but not least, the 10th plague has only left to undo the terrible commands of Pharaoh, as now it is Egyptian males who are put to death, reversing the destruction towards the Israelite male infants. This final desolation against Egypt not only established the Passover celebration, but it finally breaks the will of the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go from bondage. Pharaoh and his nation have been devastated by poetic justice, but this is not the justice of a god that we'd expect with enlightenment virtues. This cruel destruction of homes and humans, cattle and commoners, plants and people is above and beyond anything we would call a proportionate response. All the more so when God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that God had the excuse to keep the punishments coming. For the sake of theology, it is probably better that this part of the story didn't happen. Not all myths are happy ones, but a terrible myth is better than a terrible punishment. These punishments were meted out because Pharaoh would not, or could not, be convinced by Moses and Aaron to let the Israelites go. If only God had given them some potent signs before unleashing cosmic terrors on the land. Oh, but didn't God teach Moses a few magic tricks before approaching the Pharaoh? Snake mythology. Picture this. Moses and Aaron are in Egypt trying to convince Pharaoh to let their people go. To prove they mean business, Aaron throws down his staff. Poof, it turns into a snake. Sounds like a cool magic trick, right? But then Pharaoh's own magicians do the same thing. Still, in a surprising twist, Aaron's snake staff eats the others. Now, if you're scratching your head thinking, what's the snake staff's magic? It helps to know a bit about ancient Egyptian culture. It also signals that we are dealing with mythology. For those who've dived into Egyptian history, the snake staff isn't just a random magical item. Ancient Egyptian art is full of these serpent staffs. Gods like Thoth, Nehipku, and Heka are often shown holding them. But why snakes? Well, in Egypt, creatures like snakes, crocodiles, and scorpions were seen as protective symbols against harmful animals. But snakes weren't just about protection. In Egyptian mythology, they had many roles and were linked to several gods and goddesses like Apophis, Hathor, and Isis, to name a few. So when Aaron and the Pharaoh's magicians had a snake staff showdown, it wasn't just about who had the better trick. It was a deep cultural and spiritual challenge, rooted in beliefs that went back centuries. Was the snake staff scene just a cultural reflection of an old Egyptian magic trick where people trained snakes to act stiff as a rod? There may be evidence to support this idea. We will continue showing the snake mythology because this scene could fit into the broader myth where the bronze serpent in the wilderness gets a scene. The serpent staff in the wilderness may have mythological associations with Egypt, but let's explore a few other ideas. In the old days, like ancient Greece old, there was this god called Asclepius, who was all about healing. Picture him with a staff and a snake slithering around it. Fast forward a bit, and the Romans had a similar figure named Asclepiapus, with the same snake staff setup. Today, this symbol has become an international shorthand for medicine. Now there's another similar looking symbol, a staff with not one but two snakes, plus a pair of wings at the top. You might see this on ambulances. This one belongs to Hermes in Greece and Mercury in Rome. While it's often mixed up with our first symbol and called a caduceus, it's technically the Hermes-Mercury one. Hermes wasn't into medicine like Asclepius. Instead, he was the go-to god for delivering messages and guiding souls to the afterlife. So when you see this on an ambulance, it's less about the medicine and more about speedy service and the journey of life. It's fascinating how symbols from thousands of years ago still show up in our modern world, isn't it? The stories they tell connect us with ancient civilizations and remind us of our shared human journey. Within the biblical framework, serpents often depicted as multi-headed sea monsters play a significant role, embodying primordial forces that are ultimately subdued by the divine. These creatures, reminiscent of primordial antagonists, resonate with broader ancient Near Eastern traditions, wherein deities engage in epic cosmic battles against agents of chaos, especially those emerging from watery depths. A notable divergence exists. While neighboring cultures frequently conceptualize the cosmos as a battleground between inherent evil and order, the biblical narrative leans toward a worldview where the cosmos intrinsically reflects divine goodness. Yet the biblical tradition does not stand isolated. It dialogues and integrates motifs familiar to its ancient audience, as evident in verses such as Isaiah 27:1, Isaiah 51:9, and Psalm 74:13-14, among others. Serpents, while sometimes symbols of fertility and prosperity in the ancient Near East, frequently manifest as adversaries conquered by deities, notably storm gods. Ugaritic literature, a vital corpus from the ancient Levantine city of Ugarit, offers categories of divine beings, benevolent deities, often anthropomorphic and associated with tamed animals, and their destructive counterparts, typically linked with wild creatures and monstrous forms, including serpents. Artifacts from the early Bronze Age, particularly Old Anatolian and Old Syrian seals, frequently depict storm deities triumphing over serpent adversaries. Additionally, in Canaanite mythology, figures like the goddess Anat and the god Baal confront multi-headed serpents, such as Lotan, an entity analogous to the biblical Leviathan. A compelling parallel can be drawn between the description in Isaiah 27:1 and an Ugaritic passage detailing the defeat of the serpent Leighton. The destruction of this chaos agent leads to cosmic repercussions. In sum, the motif of divine triumph over chaotic serpents transcends cultural boundaries, serving as a testament to shared themes and narratives in the ancient Near East. Snakes are found everywhere, and knowing exactly which mythology influenced the serpent motif in the Moses story will depend on what one highlights the most. I think the geographical setting of Egypt should allow the Egyptian mythology to have primary influence on the Moses myth, but we know that these earlier ancient Near Eastern mythologies influenced the Greek mythology. So if these authors were influenced with the serpent staff from the Greek Asclepius, it wouldn't shock me one bit. The moral of this story, friends, is that it is mythology and not history. But let's take a closer look at the lawgivers in the ancient world. Laying down the law. Where do laws come from? Today, we understand them coming about through a political process of legislation and ruling by judges. But if you were a king in antiquity, how did you convince someone of your authority, let alone righteousness? Claims of a greater power giving you the right to make laws would go a long way. Even today, many theists will claim that morality can only exist by founding all laws and morals in the commandments of the deity. In the ancient Near East, it wasn't all that different. The quintessential example of a king showcasing their fitness to legislate is the Babylonian king Hammurabi. His famous code, composed and etched into stone by 1750 BCE, stands today in the Louvre Museum in Paris, an ancient witness to the king's claims to divine right. Atop this stele is an image of Hammurabi, the king and the sun god Shamash. Shamash was not just there to be radiant, as he was also the god of law and justice. In this relief, Shamash is passing along signs of rulership to Hammurabi. In the epilogue of the inscription below this relief, it says,
"The king who ruleth among the kings of the cities am I. My words are well considered. There is no wisdom unlike unto mine. By the command of Shamash, the great judge of heaven and earth, let righteousness go forth in the land. Hammurabi, the king of righteousness, on whom Shamash has conferred right or law am I. My words are well considered. My deeds are not equaled. To bring low those that were high, to humble the proud, to expel insolence."
Among the prescriptions in this code, some sound just a little bit biblical.
"If an ox be a goring ox, and it is shown that he is a gorer, and he do not bind his horns or fasten the oxen up, and the ox gore a freeborn man and kill him, the owner shall pay 1/2 a mina in money."
Compare that to Exodus 21:29-30.
If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner is also to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded.
Pretty similar, though the biblical injunction seems harsher than the Babylonian version. Nonetheless, it doesn't take a Yahweh to tell someone how to write up a law about an animal out of control. Even more starkly similar is Code 196 compared to Exodus 21:23-25.
If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
While there may not be a strong case of genetic connection between these law codes, the similarities do suggest there were common ideas floating around in antiquity. And no, the biblical laws are not older, not by a long shot. After all, the Code of Hammurabi was written centuries before the alleged time of the Exodus. And we have the actual inscription itself, not the story of why the original laws of God were smashed and lost, composed perhaps centuries later. Still. So we know, before any Hebrew writer put stylus to clay, the idea that the gods provided the laws was well established, and the same sorts of laws were used in these legal codes written over centuries. Centuries later, the need to at least claim a divine source for the laws was expected. In Plato's unfinished dialogue, the aptly named Laws has its characters make plenty of claims of grandiose origins to the laws of various Greek peoples. The Cretans said they got their laws from Zeus, who was born on that island. The Spartans got their laws from the Oracle of Delphi, an oracle in communion with Apollo. In the works of Plato, the Athenians say their laws were revealed by their goddess of wisdom, Athena. Other law codes and inscriptions by the Greeks and Romans would all claim at least the seal of approval by the gods. If anything, someone claiming that the laws were due to the laws of nature and the rights of men and women would have been a stranger in a strange land. There is no mystery in saying that someone received laws for a god, even if it were a myth. So there is nothing strange for the laws of the Hebrew Bible to be claimed as of divine origin, even if they are not any more likely to have been God-given than the laws of Athens, Crete, and Babylon. But if you wanted to talk to the gods directly and get the law from them, how would you do it? Where would you go? Well, fortunately, it was well known where the gods lived. Up there, above, often at the top of a mountain. Famously in Greece, there was Mount Olympus, where Zeus and his fellow deities resided. But plenty of other mythologies had a council of gods living at the top of a tall mountain. Closer to the Holy Land was Mount Zaphon, along the modern Syrian-Turkish border. Here, the Ugaritic pantheon lived and conducted business. What is interesting is that the location of the Ugaritic gods was not some mystery to the Jews, because the prophet Isaiah knows this place and its importance. In his prophecy against some unnamed and boastful Babylonian king, Isaiah says the king wants to climb up Mount Zaphon and be above the gods.
You said to yourself, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah 14.
So plenty of Jews knew that the place to find the assembly of gods was up a high mountain. Is there any mystery then that if Moses wanted to go and visit God, he would need to ascend a tall mountain? Just like a Greek would have to climb Mount Olympus, or a man from Ugarit would have to climb Mount Zaphon. And lest we forget, the mountain of God was a place Israelites visited all the time in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. If we look to the Jewish prophetic literature, we find another place for visiting the divine realm, and at the top of a mountain. In the vision, the prophet Ezekiel, as recorded in Ezekiel 40:2-4.
In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. He took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze, who was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. The man said to me, Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention to everything I'm about to show you, for that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel, everything you see.
Ezekiel then gets a collection of rules to follow for the proper building of a temple. Later in Ezekiel 43:2, God is seen.
I saw the glory of God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory.
Here again, we have the ever-radiant sun-like deity, visitations at the top of a mountain, and the delivery of instructions for mortals to follow. When we come to Moses the lawgiver, then the imagery of a righteous man receiving a set of legal codes from a god was not extraordinary. Going up a mountain to chat with the deity was also understandable, though only the worthy could ascend to the divine realm and return. We should also remember that when Moses returned from his mountaintop chat with God in Exodus 34, carrying the 2 tablets of commandments, his face was glowing. Encounters with the divine are special affairs, and often deities are radiant, but we also should note that the specific god of righteousness in Babylonian myth was the sun god, and even Yahweh could get in on the sunny action, since Malachi 4:2 calls God the Son of Righteousness. This shining radiance of God may also be hinted at by the location of God's mountain, depending on which story you are reading. The place that Moses received God's commandments was called either Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. While it is strange that the Bible isn't consistent with the name of this holy place, the meaning of these places may provide another interesting clue to the creativity of the biblical authors. The name Horeb comes from a root word meaning a dry place, but the name is potentially derived from the word har, to mean glowing or burning. Sinai may also allow for some interesting wordplay. In Hebrew, Sinai is similar sounding to Sinai, the name of a kind of bush. The burning bush was first encountered on Mount Horeb, according to Exodus 3, a burning Sinai on the mountain of burning, Horeb, which is otherwise called Sinai. The artistry is wonderful, is it not? Combining tropes of divine legal codes, radiant mountaintop gods, and some wordplay, and we truly have here a good book. But one will be hard-pressed to find the locations of these mountains. While we know the exact position of the summits of Olympus and Zaphon, the place of Mount Sinai has been suggested anywhere from Saudi Arabia to Syria. If you think the mountain has to obviously be in the modern Sinai Peninsula, you will need to know the peninsula gets its name from one of the alleged places of the mountain, not vice versa. This is just one more example of dogma trying to remake reality. Fact is, there probably wasn't a burning bush talking to Moses, because there probably wasn't a Moses at all. Did Moses write the Torah and about his own death? Now I hear you saying, of course we know Moses existed and did all sorts of amazing things because he wrote the Torah. Do you really doubt a person existed if they wrote a book about their life and accomplishments? And indeed, the tradition that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible was well established by the time of Christianity. In John 5:46, Jesus says,
If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me.
But modern scholarship doubts there's a single author to this collection of books, and the evidence is considerable. But for now, let's assume for the sake of argument that Moses was the author or editor of the Torah. If that were true, then there will be some rather strange occurrences in this book. One oddity is that Moses likes to talk about himself a lot in the third person. Instead of saying, I said to Pharaoh, let my people go, Exodus 5:1 reads,
Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go.
If Moses wrote this, then why is he writing like Moses is another person than the narrator? Do we think this was a normal habit for Moses? Did he normally sit at the dinner table and say, Moses would like hummus with Moses's matzah? Not likely. Additionally, Moses must have lacked any sense of irony if he wrote this.
Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth.
Amazing if Moses could see God and be filled with wisdom, but he couldn't see the absurdity claiming to be the best at being humble. There are additional signs that the person writing the book of Deuteronomy places themselves in the Holy Land. For example, Moses is giving a speech to the Israelites while on the other side of the Jordan River in Deuteronomy 1:1. Moses would never cross over the river into Palestine. So writing about Moses on the other side of or beyond the Jordan is written from the perspective of someone not beyond the Jordan. In other words, someone writing inside of Palestine. Some biblical translations hide this little detail, and perhaps they must because of the problems it causes. But the words are Baver ha-Yarden, meaning in the region beyond the Jordan. That's how it was understood by the translators of the Hebrew into Greek, how it was translated by Jerome into Latin, and how it was translated into German by Martin Luther. Such a clue indicates that the author of this book isn't Moses. Perhaps the most obvious problem is how Moses writes about his own death.
And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Deuteronomy 34.
Wouldn't you agree that it's pretty hard to write about one's own death? And the funeral that happened after, and no one knows where he was buried, quote, to this day, end quote. Doesn't that suggest a long time has passed? And if you think this was prophecy, then why did Moses not know where he was buried? This snippet of text is clearly written by someone not even pretending to be Moses, and composed many years after the alleged time of the great leader. Even evangelicals will concede that Moses didn't write this portion of the Torah, suggesting that Joshua filled in the final gaps. So that means Moses did write the Pentateuch, except where he didn't? Yeah, that's the ticket. Let's look at this without the Moses tinted glasses. If this were any other text, and it showed signs that it had parts that could not have been written by the person tradition alleges wrote it, we wouldn't make excuses for that tradition. Unless there is actual positive evidence that Moses wrote anything, then supposing he wrote everything minus the last part of Deuteronomy is dogma, not data. Pile this on top of the additional negative evidence, and we can only have one conclusion. Whoever wrote the Pentateuch, it probably wasn't Moses. Heck, it probably wasn't even a single composition. But let's leave the documentary hypothesis for another time. We can't go into all the evidence against Mosaic authorship today. Besides, we have a bigger problem: an Exodus without a Moses. Exodus myth, a growing cultural memory. The origins of the tradition that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and then rescued is still debated by scholars, even when ignoring the fundamentalist claiming every jot and tittle of the Bible is 100% history. However, we will explore one approach to understanding the story of the Exodus, not by reading the story in its current form, but what impact the tradition had on Jews through the centuries. In other words, let's trace out the cultural memory of the Exodus tradition and see how it changes over time. You might be surprised to see what and who is and is not in the story. When it comes to tracking down that history, we need datable sources, and here we can potentially rely on the works attributed to the prophets of ancient Israel and Judah. We do have to be careful of the work of the quill or stylus of a later editor, but the prophets of the time before and during the Babylonian exile can help us see what was central to the psyche of people in Palestine. Among the oldest of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, there is Amos from the northern kingdom of Israel. Several passages seem to know of an Exodus tradition, but one verse is particularly interesting here. In Amos 9:7, he said,
"Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?"
Wait. The God of Israel, Isaac and Jacob, rescued not just the Israelites, but also the Philistines and Arameans? These are the same Philistines that will be causing trouble for the judges and first kings of Israel. And God also saved them from bondage? It's almost as if there wasn't all that special of a relationship between God and his chosen people. But when were these people brought up? The Bible doesn't provide much in the way of clues, but modern archaeology has explored a time when the Philistines and Arameans came to prominence, and it was at the end of the Bronze Age. In fact, the catalyst seems to be the Bronze Age collapse, when the great civilizations of 2nd millennium BCE faded out, some disappearing forever. The only country to mostly survive the collapse and the marauding sea peoples of this time was Egypt. Yet, Egypt was then so weak it lost its holdings in Palestine, allowing the people to become free. The Philistines were the descendants of some of those very sea peoples, as they were allowed to live in the region of modern-day Gaza. The Arameans emerged after the decline of the Middle Assyrian Empire at around the same time. And we know from an Egyptian stele a century before the Bronze Age collapse, there was a people group called Israel in northern Palestine, and the Egyptian army controlled them up until the Egyptian empire crumbled with the rest of the ancient Near East. So it was not because of divine intervention, but general regional instability that these people groups began to throw off the yoke of great power. If we turn to a contemporary Israelite prophet, Hosea, he also knows of the Exodus tradition. He doesn't say anything about Philistines as part of the rescue package, and instead he focuses on the specialness of Israel to God. However, neither Hosea nor Amos, as best as we can tell, know of the most spectacular parts of the Exodus story, and at best, there are hints of a time in the wilderness. Most astounding, neither prophet names the leader of the Jews out of Egypt. Look, and you will not find the name of Moses. Hosea is, at best, coy when he said in 12:13 that the Israelites were brought out of Egypt by a prophet. Does he not know who it was that was called by God? Strange, is it not? But let's keep going. If we turn to contemporary prophets in the southern kingdom of Judah, we find that the great Isaiah and Micah say nothing. Indeed, when scholars subtract away some likely interpolations, there's nothing of an Exodus or a Moses at all. Here is how Bible scholar Niels Peter Lemke describes things.
All this goes to show that neither of the two Judean prophets, that is, Micah and Isaiah, from the close of the 8th century, refer to the traditions of the Exodus. If they were somehow familiar with these traditions, it is fair to say that they were of no importance either to them or to their audience. It should also be noted that the fora of these two figures were not identical, as it is well known that Isaiah was active in Jerusalem, where he apparently had access to the highest figures in Israelite society, while Micah was active in this Judean province. Thus, it would be reasonable to claim that the Pentateuchal tradition were foreign to the Judean horizon in the 8th century.
We will eventually see the Exodus tradition come down from the north to the south. After the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, and a descendant of those northern tribes would carry the Exodus to the Judean prophetic tradition. This we can see with Jeremiah, the only Judean prophet before the Babylonian exile to show any knowledge that the Jews were enslaved by Egypt. Jeremiah uses Hosea as an influence, if not a source. And unfortunately, other things that might expand beyond Hosea are plausibly interpolated by someone at a later date. What parts we can be more confident that Jeremiah said or wrote do not include signs and wonders that helped them escape Egypt, nor is there anything about a divinely appointed leader. There's a bit of a description of Israel's time in the wilderness, but it lacks golden calves and 40 years of suffering. In fact, Jeremiah 2:2-3 says, Israel was a loving bride that dutifully followed God and remained holy. In other words, the sojourn through the desert before coming to the promised land was a good time for the Jewish people. It's almost as if Jeremiah didn't have a copy of the Pentateuch to read. And once again, Moses is not to be found in Jeremiah. The only verse, Jeremiah 15:1, would include his name, but this is likely part of a larger interpolation by someone writing later. That means when the Babylonians came and destroyed the Temple of Solomon in 587 BCE, none of the prophets of God cared to mention Moses, and only a minority even knew of an Exodus story at all. The cultural memory was not widely shared until the story of Exodus made its way into a time when an Exodus was prayed for. During the Babylonian exile, the prophet Ezekiel carried on this tradition, and we can see some significant evolution. For starters, the time in the wilderness wasn't so pleasant anymore. The commandments of God were not followed, and this is why the descendants of Jacob were living in exile.
I will bring you into the wilderness of the nations, and there, face to face, I will execute judgment upon you, as I judged your ancestors in the wilderness of the land of Egypt. So I will judge you, declares the sovereign Lord. I will take note of you as you pass under my rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge you of those who revolt and rebel against me. Although I will bring them out of the land where they are living, yet they will not enter the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Then you will know that I am the Lord when I bring you into the land of Israel, the land I had sworn with uplifted hand to give to your ancestors. Ezekiel 20.
Now, we are starting to see the wilderness tradition become familiar. As in the biblical story, there was a long period of idolatry and suffering, and because the Israelites did not follow the covenant as instructed, they were punished and eventually banished into a new wilderness, the nations. Then, and only after sufficient punishment, would Israel be restored. Therefore, Ezekiel is giving a story of hope to a people who lost their land to an outside power. But once again, Moses is not to be found. Is he hiding behind a rock the whole time? Let's move on to one more prophet for now, Isaiah. Wait, didn't we already cover him? Well, we did cover the original Isaiah, but the book bearing his name was added to by two other writers at a much later time, along with additional edits to the first part of Isaiah's prophecies. The second part of Isaiah, called Deutero-Isaiah, comprises chapters 40 through 55 of a modern English Bible, and it was written at the tail end of the Babylonian exile. It is here we can see the Exodus tradition become spectacular. Let's take a look at Isaiah 45, 16 to 21.
This is what the Lord says, He who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and horses, the army and reinforcements together, and they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? Now I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people I formed for myself, that they may proclaim my praise.
Has nonetheless had an amazing effect on culture. Perhaps then the story of Moses should end with him getting a wonderful afterlife. According to Deuteronomy 34, Moses was buried in a secret place, apparently after God had personally shoveled his gravesite. But for many Jews and Christians later, this was not good enough. No. Moses needed to achieve a heavenly reward.
On his advancing thence towards the place where he was destined to disappear, they all followed him bathed in tears. Thereupon Moses, by signal of his hand, bade those in the distance to remain still, while word of mouth he exhorted those near to him not to make his passing a tearful one by following him. And they, deciding to gratify him in this also, to wit, to leave him to depart according to his own desire, held back, weeping with one another. Only the elders escorted him, with Eleazar the high priest and Joshua the general. But when he arrived on the mountain called Abaris, a lofty eminence situate over against Jericho, and affording to those on its summit a wide view beneath of the best of the land of the Canaanites, he dismissed the elders. And while he bade farewell to Eleazar and to Joshua, and was yet communing with them, a cloud of a sudden descended upon him, and he disappeared in a ravine. But he has written of himself in the sacred book that he died, for fear lest they should venture to say that by reason of his surpassing virtue he had gone back to the deity.
Having Moses taken up in a cloud might make one think of the ascension of Jesus. But the examples Josephus might actually have in mind are from Greco-Roman culture, for it was said that the founding figures of Rome, both Aeneas and Romulus, had similar heavenly ascents. Of Aeneas,
but the body of Aeneas could nowhere be found, and some conjectured that he had been translated to the god.
And of Romulus,
The more mythical writers say that as he was holding an assembly in the camp, darkness descended upon him from a clear sky and he disappeared, and they believe that he was caught up by his father Ares.
From birth to life to death and even into the afterlife, the story of Moses is a tapestry of myths and legends. There's so much diversity in the elements of this story that we must be impressed beyond the need to claim any of it happened. Conclusion. My friends, our journey following the footsteps of Moses has led us through ancient legends and lively imaginations. Like tracing a meandering river, we navigated many twists and turns in the development of this captivating character. We dove into the deep waters of myth, where Moses floated like Sargon before him. We wandered through the wilderness, finding traces of Moses in heroic patterns from lands afar. Through Canaanite whispers, we heard echoes of the Exodus and tales of gods defeating dragons. We climbed the Greek mountaintops and saw the shining walls. From the prophets' evolving songs, we learned that Moses was but a late arrival to the Exodus tradition. And peering behind the veil of his name, we glimpsed the light of an Egyptian inspiration. Though Moses may never have existed, his message resonates throughout the ages. Origins of Moses, and indeed the entirety of his legend, is as fictitious as the Promised Land itself. But in our inability to grasp the historical Moses, we have unveiled the context that gave rise to his myth. So as Moses gazed upon a land he could never enter, we too must look to the horizon beyond historicity. Our journey now is guided by the hands of critical thinking, leading us away from dogma and towards brilliant insight. By uncovering the legendary layers, we uncover new possibilities for what the timeless tale of Exodus represents. What matters is not the veracity of the myth, but the victory over our narrow bonds to literalism. The Promised Land awaits, but it cannot be defined by dogmas and boundaries. Now it is for us to finish what the myth started, to bring radical freedom and unprecedented questions, to challenge comforting assumptions. Now it is for us to sing the song of open minds. Let my people think. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel. Help support us by joining our Patreon, YouTube memberships. Also, be sure to check out the links in the description, because this documentary was co-produced with Dr. Aaron Adair and Jonathan M.S. Pierce. We hope you enjoyed. Help support us to keep doing what we're doing. Subscribe to our channels, follow us, and never forget, we are Myth Vision.